Prynawn da, croeso I bawb. Good afternoon, everyone. Ramadan Kareem and Salam Alaikum to all our Muslim colleagues, and thank you to everybody for attending today's Reflections on Ramadan event. We're really glad to have you all here, and we're really pleased with the take-up. The event is advertised. It's a public event. In order to ensure that we can manage speakers and the scheduling, we've muted the audience, but we have had questions in advance which are going to be answered at the end. Just a quick outline. My name's Danielle Williams. I'm an Equalities Officer with Bangor University, and along with colleagues and our three speakers have arranged today's event. In a second, I'm going to hand you over to Professor Edmund Burke, who is the Vice-Chancellor of Bangor University, who will then hand you over to our three lovely speakers, Mariam Awade, Farhan Wali and Amma Patana. And then we will come back to myself and I will take questions, which I will then pass out to our audience, to our panel to answer for you. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Edmund Burke. Welcome, Edmund.
Diolch, Danielle. Croeso I bawb, welcome everyone, and Ramadan Mubarak to all our Muslim attendees. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce this event. Bangor University is proud of the diversity that our students, staff and local communities bring to everything that we do. Our aim is to be an inclusive place to study and to work. And we recognise that in order to continue to grow our understanding of the world, we need to listen and to learn from each other's experiences. Our staff and students have told us that having the opportunity to learn about each other's cultures and practices is really important to them. Members of staff and students with a faith or religious identity also shared how important it is that this is acknowledged and considered in how we work. Hosting events such as today's lecture are welcome opportunities to continue to increase awareness and understanding across our whole community. Mariam, Farhan and Tom, who work here at Bangor University, are going to share perspectives and insights on Ramadan with you today. Ramadan, the practice observed by Muslims worldwide and known as the month of fasting, is a time for prayer, reflection and community. We've also made sure that there's around 10 minutes at the end of the event, as Danielle said, for our speakers to answer any questions that have been submitted. So please, if you've got questions, please do submit them before the session starts to Ingrid and Danielle. Thank you very much indeed to our three speakers for taking part today and to all of you for attending. I'm really, really looking forward to it. I'll now hand over to our first speaker, Mariam Awade, who's a PhD student in linguistics at Bangor and also the Muslim faith advisor in our chaplaincy team. Diolch yn fawr, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for that, Edward. Just going to start my timer. So, Assalamu alaikum, as we say in Arabic, which basically just simply means that we are sending peace upon you all. So, as Edward just mentioned, my name is Mariam. I am a PhD student in linguistics, as well as the faith advisor with the university's chaplaincy team. So, you may or may not be familiar with Ramadan. If you are, you might know that it is a time when Muslims fast from dawn until sunset. The dates change each year because Ramadan follows the lunar calendar. So this year, Muslims in the UK have been fasting from around 4 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. Muslims will typically break their fast, so in the evening, with a date and some water, as this was what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, peace be upon him, used to do, and it is known as a sunnah. A sunnah basically is a practice that the Prophet used to do, and many Muslims try to implement these sunnahs into their daily lives. So while fasting from food and drink is a key part of Ramadan, it is not the only thing Muslims engage in during this blessed month. In the Quran, specifically in the chapter of Al-Baqarah, the cow, there's a verse that says, fasting has been prescribed for you, as it was for those before you, so perhaps you will become mindful of Allah. So, or God. Ramadan is about much more than abstaining from food. It's a time for spiritual growth, self-discipline, reconnecting with faith, and simply becoming more conscious and mindful of Allah, God, in everything that you do. Observing Ramadan while balancing work, studies, and daily life can be very challenging. The entire routine can shift. So you wake up before dawn for suhoor, so around 3 a.m. for Muslims in the UK. Suhoor is known as the pre-fasting meal. Then you typically go about your daily responsibilities while fasting. So if you're at work, you're working. If you're a student, you're studying, you're going to lectures. And then you are breaking the fast in the evening. And then it doesn't end there. Many Muslims then go to the mosque to continue late night prayers into the evening and even to the late night. And even with these things during the day, Muslims are praying 5 times a day, from as the pictures show, from Fajr to Isha, which is the dawn to night prayer. And then we are also trying to increase our reading of the Quran, which is the holy book, and also dhikr, which is just remembering God. So it is a physically and mentally demanding schedule, but it also brings a deep sense of purpose and connection. Not all Muslims fast during Ramadan, though, and that is important to highlight. Some may be exempt due to health conditions, travel, or personal circumstances. But even if they aren't fasting, they still engage in Ramadan through different things like prayer, reflection, and acts of kindness. Ramadan is known as the month of fasting, but it is also known as the month of giving and of generosity. Charity, which is zakat in Arabic, is a core pillar of Islam, and Muslims are encouraged to donate in this month, if not just once in the month, but daily if possible, by supporting those in need, by giving to charity, whether that be financially or even just through acts of kindness. Smiling is, in fact, a form of charity, as our Prophet mentioned. And as well, we try and strengthen bonds with our family, friends, and the wider community. Mosques often host community iftars, where people break their fast together, creating a strong sense of unity. The final 10 nights of Ramadan are considered the most spiritually significant. We are currently in the last 10 nights, and actually Ramadan might be tomorrow finish or on Sunday. During these last 10 nights, many Muslims are even increasing their worships even more, their prayers even more, because they are seeking Laylatul Qadr, which is known as the night of decree. So, which was revealed in the Holy Quran, which was when the Holy Quran was revealed, and is also known as a night described in the Quran as better than 1,000 months. So Muslims believe that during this night, if you do an act, that it is rewarded 83 times more than the usual outside of Ramadan. And so Muslims will typically dedicate this time to i'tikaf, which is the Arabic word, but it basically means seclusion in the mosque. So you'll find that people are staying in the mosque and just focusing on connecting to God, focusing on their worship, prayer, and reflection. Even if you don't observe Ramadan, there are meaningful ways to engage and be supportive. So, for example, you can consider how you schedule things. Maybe try and avoid long meetings late in the afternoon, or consider holding a meeting online and face-to-face, just as what we've done today. Educators as well, if you are an educator, you can acknowledge Ramadan with a simple email or a note on lecture slides. It's very important to not assume and ask for everything, but also maybe some students will need like deadline flexibility or recorded lectures. So it might be helpful to ask what the student needs rather than just assume that that's what they need. You can also try and attend an interfaith iftar. It's a great way to learn and connect with your fellow Muslims. And also, you don't need to hide your food and drink around Muslims. You can simply ask if they mind if you eat and drink in front of them. It's not like a haram or a prohibition for you to do that in front of Muslims. Now, for students, the challenge isn't just hunger. It's staying alert in lectures, it's managing late night prayers, and it's also keeping up with assignments. Throughout Ramadan, priorities are going to shift towards personal worship and devotion, as well as maintaining bonds with family and community. So many students and colleagues will need more time for their daily prayers, and they will likely take a day off for Eid, if Eid falls on Monday this year, to celebrate the end of Ramadan. For many Muslims, Ramadan is like a spiritual reset button, a time to pause and reflect. Personally, for me, I find that it helps me realign my focus on what truly matters. So while fasting is a very key part of Ramadan, it's not the only part. Ramadan is the perfect opportunity for Muslims to pause from the demands and stressors of this world and to ultimately reflect on what our purpose is here on this world, on this earth. So whether you observe Ramadan or not, I encourage you to think about the many ways you can engage with the spiritual meaning behind it through acts of kindness, community, or contemplation. As Ibn Qayyim, a scholar, mentioned, fasting is not just about abstaining from food, it is about emptying the stomach to feed the soul. And that is ultimately our goal when we finish Ramadan, when we finally celebrate Eid, is that hopefully through the fasting, we've not only abstained from food, but we've also fed our soul and reconnected with God and built a better connection with Islam and with our Quran, and just hopefully become better people in general. So may we continue to not only nourish our bodies, but also our hearts, minds, and souls. And maybe next year in Ramadan, you can also try and do a little fast one day to try it out yourself. As I mentioned, there is only 2 days left of Ramadan now. So Muslims are trying to make the most of it, but hopefully you know what you can do as a non-Muslim to engage with your fellow Muslims next year when Ramadan comes soon, inshallah, God willing. So thank you. Now I will pass the virtual mic to Farhan and I will stop sharing.
Okay, thank you, Mariam. Okay, I'm just going to start my slide. Okay, so thank you, everyone. So my talk really is just going to explore the deeper meanings of fasting across different religious traditions. Now, there is perhaps an assumption that, fasting is unique to Islam and Muslims. Clearly, as we know, that's not the case. Fasting as a religious practice occurs across different faith communities. Now, there is one specific common, perhaps, assumption, which is that fasting is purely a ritualistic practice. Now, that seemingly ignores the other deeper aspects, such as the social, the ethical, as well as the identity and community issues. And it's some of those broader features that I want to kind of perhaps focus on in the talk. Now, the first thing that I really want to address is perhaps the origins of fasting, to see how it became a significant aspect for religious traditions. Now, if we go back to the earliest societies, we can see that in the prehistoric period, when societies were very much animistic, that there was a need to kind of adopt fasting. Now, fasting becomes a necessity in many ways because it's a direct response to nature. Early societies obviously discovered that they were dependent on nature for their very survival. And due to changes in the natural cycle, they encountered periods of food scarcity. So there were periods when they had food, and there were large periods where they didn't have food. And therefore, fasting became an aspect of their utility. They needed fasting to adapt, to survive. And eventually, what happens is that fasting is linked to sacred times. So they fast during specific times of the year. And also then it becomes more connected to ritual purity. So for example, in early shamanistic religions, often fasting was used to essentially prepare the individual practitioner to engage in a vision quest. So it was very much starts to become connected with ritual, with purification, and these things. So what we then see is a shift from nature-based kind of religious systems, where it's very much fasting is about the physical necessity, to organized religions which emerge when human societies obviously develop and progress. This is where obviously religious thought becomes very much sophisticated and more structured. And here we see actually the kind of institutionalization, if you will, of fasting. So the key point here is that there was a transition from physical necessity, early societies having that physical need to fast, to it becoming then a symbolic act, a ritualistic act, part of the religious system. So if we look at some examples, so for example, in Judaism, we have Yom Kippur, which is obviously the Day of Atonement, which very much is about the need to repent and to seek forgiveness. So it's very much about that aspect of reflecting. If we obviously look at Lent as well, obviously most Christians seek to mirror the sacrifice that Jesus did for fasting for 40 days. Again, this is encouraging aspects of self-control, self-denial, as well as deep reflection. So we can see there's kind of commonalities. And Islam, as we looked at it, basically is about devotion to God. And this ultimately is about kind of a reinforcement of the kind of goal, which is to submit to God. Now, again, other religious systems, like in Hinduism, we have Ekadashi, which is basically a fast that is observed twice a month. And again, this is about reinforcing your devotion to a particular deity. So, for example, Vishnu. And again, there are elements of spiritual purification here. So what we want to really focus on is fasting and religious identity. If we look at the practice of fasting, it transcends the individual. It is very much encapsulated as a communal experience. So those who fast often engage in it in terms of a communal practice. So it's the family, it's the village, it's the community engaging in fasting together, which brings about a sense of unity because they're doing the same act and it's across the street. So that generates that sense of familiarity and sameness, which gives a sense of collective unity. So, for example, in Ramadan, iftar is the kind of breaking of the fast, but that is done very much collectively. It's done in the family dynamic. It's done in the mosque or communally. So it brings people together that perhaps throughout the year may not have interacted. Also in Lent, if we look at Lent, it's a collective time. It's a time for collective communities to reflect on the meaning and the significance of Jesus's sacrifice. So again, this is encouraging some common elements of devotion and reflection. In terms of also when we look at fasting as an expression of religious identity, a key element of obviously fasting is the fact that it reinforces your individual identity within the faith. So fasting is a marker for identity because it distinguishes those who are fasting with those who are not. So what that does, if a Muslim is fasting in Ramadan, that's an expression of their Muslim identity. So again, it reinforces those important elements. Obviously as well, this is not just individualistic. It's not just the relationship between you and God that is the focus. There's also that kind of collective aspect that comes from performing the same ritual as your fellow practitioners. Just to kind of end really, the last couple of points, we need to probably reflect on the kind of spiritual transformation that fasting encourages in some ways. So if we look at it as an act of self-discipline and developing inner strength, obviously when one fasts, they're actively going against their innate instinct, which is to eat. So you're actually resisting that physical urge, that physical need. And what that creates is a sense of control and discipline. Um, of course, also, this helps because obviously we live in a very kind of materialistic society. There is now this emphasis on instant gratification, and fasting kind of counteracts that because it encourages this self-discipline. Now, in terms of also reliance, fasting provides this kind of physical challenge. It's a lengthy period of enduring the absence of food, which can be difficult. So again, that encourages that kind of self-control and kind of overcoming your impulses. Now, to just kind of end really, if we look at the ethical aspect and the mindfulness, I think Mariam mentioned in Ramadan, there is a key aspect of charity which practitioners engage in. So again, we can see that fasting has been associated with ethical reflection, that by experiencing hunger, we're feeling empathy for those that perhaps aren't able to eat or are experiencing hunger. So again, these things are manifest and encouraged through the process of fasting. I'll end it there. And obviously we'll have time for questions. But now what I'll do, I'll pass over to the next speaker.
Thanks, Farhan. Appreciate it. My name is, I'm just trying to share my screen in a second. Hopefully you'll be able to get that. My name is Dr. Amar Patana. I'm a consultant diabetologist and also a number of other things that I do, but also an honorary senior lecturer at Bangor University. I am not Muslim, I'm Hindu, but I have a broad experience of fastings, particularly intermittent fasting, or as we like to call it, time-restricted eating. As you can imagine, we're dealing with people who have diabetes. There's a lot of focus on diet, and there's a lot of various diets, various regimes, various treatments that are possible in the dietary setting. So something that I have come across, in a clinical setting for a number of years now. Closer to home, actually, I have been practicing intermittent fasting for the last 5 years now, since the pandemic, effectively, or just before. And it's something that I've found great success with for personally. So some of the things I will mention if it's a personal experience. But essentially, I guess when we're talking about the various faith-related fasting, science behind that, and I'm just trying to go a little bit about that. I'll try to keep it fairly simple and straightforward because there's a lot of data around Ramadan and fasting and the impact on health, but there's also a lot of data on fasting in general. So I thought I'd stick to that, and then we can proceed and see how we go. So the first thing to really mention with fasting is essentially understanding the physiology, how the body responds to food or lack of food. So we've got two states: the fed state, where we've had food, and the fasted state, where we're not eating. So in the fed state, there's food intake, the blood sugar in the body increases, so the food gets broken down and the blood sugars increase. The whole point of a lot of the reason why we eat is to give ourselves energy, give us a body an ability to function through various mechanisms, through all the energy processes that you knew in biology and in primary, secondary school, and beyond in med school, for my sake. So you get blood sugars that increase, and when your blood sugars increase, your body responds and says, okay, the sugars are quite high, higher than I'd like them to be. So we need to use that sugar. And insulin is the gatekeeper. It's a hormone in the body that's released. And so it helps the body regulate the blood sugar levels. It will make the body utilize that blood sugar more for energy, so as we can function. But also, if there's more than it needs, what it will do is also it will say to the body, okay, we need to store this sugar. We need to store it in the form of carbohydrate in the liver, or we can also store it as fat, depending on the situation. So that's what insulin does. It's a anabolic hormone. It builds the body effectively and builds those stores. And that's when we're eating. So the more you eat, the more. So if you're eating, you eat enough for your immediate energy requirements. But if it's you're eating more than you need, or the blood sugars go up more than it needs to, then that'll get converted to carbohydrate stores and fat. Whereas the opposite happens in a fasted state. So generally for the body to go into the fasted state, we're looking at about 12 hours or so of no food intake, no kind of sugar intake. Well, not sugar, but any form of energy or carbohydrate intake. So when that happens, the body senses this, the blood sugar levels may be lower a bit, and therefore the body says, no, we need to maintain that balance. The body is all about keeping balance. And so it will release another hormone, also released but in the same area as the insulin, but in the pancreas, but it's called glucagon. And that glucagon release will then go and mobilize the body's stores. So it says, okay, we need more blood sugars. Let's break down the carbohydrate stores in the liver. Let's break down the fat stores with time if we need more if we need more of that. So this fasted state is what predicts really a lot of that weight loss and that fat breakdown and store breakdown. It's important to remember, and I get this a lot because, again, across any form of fasting, any form of dietary intervention, let's say, overall, calorie output greater than calorie input results in an imbalance, an energy deficit, and therefore can result in weight loss and other effects. If you're fasting, but when you are eating, you're eating a considerable amount more than your calorie intake for that recommended for the day. It's 2,000 to 2,500, depending on if you're a woman or a man. And so if your intake is greater than your output, then that will contribute towards more the fed state and more kind of storage and fat deposition and glucose. Whereas if your output is less, then you'll switch more into the carbohydrate store breakdown and fat breakdown. And this is what happens really for a lot of us, and what happens when we do fast. Now, this is a more specific aspect of what happens, and I'm not going to go too much in detail. There's periods of intermittent fasting which can cause a lot of cellular level changes. There's periods of when you don't fast and your periods of recovery when you're sleeping and resting that cause other changes. Essentially, your body adapts over time as you fast. That could be weeks, or that could be months, it could be even shorter, longer. Your body adapts, and it results in a lot of changes. If you look at the health changes, you can get changes in fat, obviously fat deposition, reduction in inflammation in the body, and changes in blood pressure as well as blood sugars, a few other things. So this is kind of the science behind it. I won't focus too much on it, but there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than the simplification I did in the previous slide. Now, when we look at fasting, there are various options. There are various things that are possible, various dietary forms of fasting, rather than a traditional religious or kind of cultural dependent fasting. There's scientific kind of fasting where you can look at alternate day regimes where you fast every other day and you fast for 24 hours. There's 5-2 diet, which is well known, where you eat normally for 5 days and 2 days you go through a calorie restriction, a low calorie diet. No, it's low calorie diet, not just carbs, low calorie. And then there's time restricted eating or feeding, where you look at any variation between 14 to 18 hours a day. So this is what intermittent fasting is where you break periods of the day where you're fasting for a prolonged period of time, more than that 12-hour period. Usually it's about 14, 15, or 16 hours. 16-8 is a traditional one. And some people do 18-6, so 18 hours fasting, 6 hours you can eat. And that doesn't mean you eat a lot in those 6 hours, but you eat, reasonable amounts. And you can see the similarities between Ramadan or any kind of religious fasting and the periods of time where you can eat and just talking about. And there's a few other things, a few other different regimes here, depending on different people. What I will say, and from experience, but also from speaking to patients and people who have been doing this, is that you find if you aren't doing it for cultural reasons, what we find is that dieting is different for different people. What may work for one person may not work for the other. I remember trying a low calorie diet, and I was getting headaches and not maintaining it. I could do it for a few months, and then I would stop. Whereas when I switched to intermittent fasting, that was a more sustainable process of balance on my calorie output, let's say. And I think that's something that when we talk to people who are practicing fasting or intermittent time restricted eating for other reasons beyond the cultural side of things, that's what we kind of have to bear in mind. Now, there are a variety of benefits that have been seen with time restricted eating, and these are across the kind of the metabolic health side of things, but also something looking at the heart as well. So time restricted eating, if done correctly in the right way, can cause a reduction in waist circumference, reducing fat mass and fat deposition, as we can see, in terms of the unhealthy cholesterol, let's say the LDLs, low density lipoproteins, triglycerides, total cholesterol, a reduction in your fasting insulin, so your body's not releasing as much insulin. Your blood pressure can reduce, your blood sugars can reduce, and it can increase your good cholesterol, the HDL, which can do, and a few other fatty acids as well. There's also possible benefits and postulated benefits on aging. So the body doesn't age as much if people who fast approach it the right way. Reduction in inflammation, total body inflammation, and cognition and memory and that side of things. So there are a variety of different possible benefits that have been seen from a health perspective when you are fasting. And these are some of the things that have been shown. But essentially, I think this alludes to a lot, is that this is still an area that is still being under more scrutiny, I guess, in the healthcare system. I mean, there wasn't too much data on time-restricted eating or fasting from a metabolic health perspective until the last 5-6 years, is the honest answer. Well, about 6 years or so. We've known a lot about Ramadan and cultural-related fasting and impact, but perhaps not the health and dietary side of things with regards to metabolic health and systemic health. So what there's a lot has been suggesting, this is actually a paper from America that I was looking at, saying that actually we need to have more education for colleagues about what the impact of health, time restricted eating and on health is, and various parameters across a variety of different specialists, and also perhaps look at even considering prescriptions and how we sort of advise people appropriately on this area. And again, this is I'm aware that we're talking about Ramadan just slightly different, but in the setting of time restricted eating, there are elements that we can bring forward into how we advise and how we support people who want to look at this in a longer term setting. So it's kind of a little bit of a brief overview of the science behind the area. There's a lot more we could talk about, but I'm happy to end this part of the conversation there, and happy to hand back to my colleagues to take this further for questions.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers. There's some really interesting insights there. Thank you for sharing your expertise, and I hope it's been really interesting for our audience too. So thank you again to our speakers for your time, but we are not finished with you yet. We have some questions that we'd like to ask, and we actually had some more come in during the session. So I hope it's okay. Thank you for submitting questions from our audience members. The first question I'd like to ask is to Mariam, and the question that came in was, what does a typical day look like fasting as a Muslim person?
So a typical day, typically, as I mentioned, fasting right now in the UK starts from 4 a.m. to around 6:30 p.m. So typically you would wake up around like 3 a.m. and prepare your suhoor, which is the pre-dawn meal. That depends on like your culture as well. So some people might have like samosas, some might have like eggs, cereal. Typically, like in the last days, people are so like tired from all like the worship and the praying at the mosque that they typically just have water and dates. So then that happens, and then you get ready for the first prayer of the day, which is Fajr. So that happens. And then it depends on what you have next. If you can manage to like take a little nap before you have to go to work or university, then some might do that. Others might stay awake and read from the Quran, do more prayer, make like dua, so asking God for certain things that they would like. And then the day would go on, and then around midday is when we would pray like Dhuhr prayer, which is the second prayer of the day. Then the day goes on as well, so working or university. And then we have Asr prayer, which is around like 5 p.m., 4 to 5 p.m. And then again, it depends on the person's schedule, but they might start preparing the iftar, which is the breaking fast. Again, that depends again for the person. Some people will just prepare like soup and salad. Some might like do rice dishes. And typically you'd like call your family over and you'd break your fast together. You'd pray Maghrib, which is the prayer when the sun sets. And then typically you'd rest for a bit from the food. And then typically many mainly the males, but also some of the females will go to the mosque to get ready for the final prayer of the day, which is known as Isha, but also to stay in the mosque for Taraweeh, which is a prayer that is specific to Ramadan. It's a set of 2 prayers that you can do from 8 to 20 sets, and people will typically do that. And then it depends on the person if they decide to stay up or go to sleep. But yeah, that's a typical day. Reading Quran as well, trying to incorporate that through the day as well.
Thank you, Mariam. And our next question, I think, is for Farhan, actually, and it is something that you picked up on in your lecture. The question is around consumerism and self-discipline. So in what ways can fasting teach us about self-discipline and resilience in an era dominated by consumerism and instant gratification? So over to you, Farhan.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a good question. I think obviously we live in a very consumer-driven society, and what that can do in the modern is generate this kind of the need for instant gratification. Now, as I kind of mentioned, our earlier ancestors didn't have that developed because they had to endure long periods of food scarcity. So it's a modern phenomenon where we have this need for instant kind of gratification. We can get things very easily and quickly in terms of our food. Now, what that does is ultimately it encourages impulsive behavior. So what fasting then can do is it can counteract that, and it can create and stimulate discipline and self-control. So if we are obviously existing in this very consumer-orientated instant gratification culture, then fasting offers a way to control those kind of urges, and it can discipline us physically and mentally. So I think it's an important aspect of countering some of those aspects. But thank you.
Thank you for that, Farhan. I'm going to ask a few questions of Amar because we've had some that have come in that people are quite keen, I think. We've got some people who are either fasting or considering fasting, so we've got some questions for you. And they're around practical advice you would give for someone who's considering fasting. However, there's some added bits in there. Sorry, Amar, to put you on the spot.
No worries, no
we've got a
worries.
question from a young person who's saying, what's the best way or the best advice around starting fasting if you're a young person? And then I have another question for you.
Okay, so I'm approaching these questions with my clinical diabetes hat on, as I do. So what I would do in this setting is identify, I think, in a way, it's identifying firstly, it's about the reasons for the fasting side of things. So is it the dietary side? Is it weight? What are the reasons behind it? So there'd be all that side of things I'd explore. But in terms of getting into it, I think part of it is research and a bit of knowledge. So understanding for the person what have they understood about the fasting beforehand? What methods have they come across? Speaking to colleagues, speaking to friends, or tried themselves. I spoke for myself. I tried different things that didn't work. So it's understanding what has or hasn't worked in the past and what their priorities are in that setting. Understanding if there's any other health conditions as well, because there's certain times if you are fasting, if you have, for example, I use it from my perspective, if you have diabetes, if you have type 1 diabetes, for example, if you're fasting and your blood sugars drop low, that is potentially very worrying. So we don't want that to happen. If you have other health conditions that may result in adverse outcomes, we don't want that. Tied quite closely to fasting is also fluid intake. And sometimes when you follow a certain diet, you perhaps don't hydrate as much as you do. As when we eat, we tend to drink a lot more. So again, that the lack of fluid, separate to kind of the lack of that food intake, could also have impact on that person. So it's a lot of understanding a lot more about that. What I would say is, if, for example, if you are, say, for example, trying time-restricted eating and looking at changing your regimes, it would be more around, because there's quite a spectrum with time-restricted eating. You could do 16 and 8. You could do 18 and 6, or you could do something in between. I would say getting beyond that 12-hour fast, getting used to the routine of that reduction in your caloric intake and your food intake is for the first thing. And you may not be successful. You may find actually in the weekdays when you're working, when you're busy, that's fine. The weekends are difficult. But it's identifying that in yourself and slowly, not jumping straight in perhaps if you can't, but finding the system that works and eases you into it until it eventually develops. The first 3 months of any dietary change are probably the hardest, where you're trying to adjust to that. And then once it becomes part of your routine and once you become used to it, then your body adjusts and your mindset adjusts as well. And it's yeah, as I say to myself and anyone else, it's finding the thing that works for you. That's the first startup point.
Thank you, Amar. And the other question that came in around fasting was, can you or should you be exercising whilst fasting?
That's a very good question, actually. And it boils down to that first slide if you just want to show about input versus output. So output also includes energy expenditure as well. Now, done in the right way, exercise will enhance some of the effects. If you're dieting for the right reason in terms of weight loss and healthy body, then exercise will help that. Now, the issue is if you're not eating anything for a long period of time and exercising, your body does not have enough reserves, and actually you've not hydrated well, then you could collapse. You could have, you may not be able to maximize your potential in that exercise side. So what I would say is yes, and initially, I guess when you're starting your diet, the way I've worked and the way I work with people as well is saying, start the diet, develop, get that routine in place with regards to the diet. And once you've got that routine in place, then you can add in the exercise side of things. And it depends what kind of exercise. If you're doing, high intensity exercises, high interval training, or if you're doing weight gain, or if you muscle building, or if you're doing just general, aerobic versus anaerobic exercises, there's a variety of different things you can do, which will impact your energy reserves. You can exercise, to answer the question, but I would say it depends on the type of exercise, and I would build a graded system where you build up towards it from the diet through to the intensity of the exercise you're doing. Going straight in and everything is not going to work. It's not going to be sustainable. Build it up from the diet, then to the intensity of the exercise you're doing, and building that into your routine as well. That's the way it's most likely to succeed. And personally, that's also worked for me that way.
Lovely, thank you. I'm going to ask one last question of the panel to close, and it's for each of you in turn. Maybe we'll do Mariam, then Farhan, and then Amar again. What one bit of advice would you give people who are attending today to support either colleagues, the students we teach, or friends or family or loved ones who are fasting during Ramadan?
That's a good question. I think maybe the main thing is don't assume that all the Muslims are fasting. Some, as I mentioned, might not be fasting for certain reasons. So don't assume, and just simply ask, how best can you help and support your colleague or your student? What would they like you to do? I think that's the main thing.
Yeah, for me, I think it's just further awareness can help. Fasting can be difficult on the body, especially if you're in Ramadan, where you're not also having water, so you're quite dehydrated. So just, being aware of the needs perhaps, and that can help those that are fasting. But it should always be an open dialogue. There's no kind of restricted questions. If people are curious, they then feel free to ask questions.
Yeah, Farhan matched what I was going to say. The phrase that came to mind was, "It's not easy." So it was the impact of fasting or time restricted eating or whatever they're doing on them, on as a person, but also on them, physically as well, and be more mindful of that side aspect when you're interacting with them, is what I would say.
Great. Diolch yn fawr, everyone. Thank you and shukran, particularly to our speakers for giving up your time today and giving us all your insights. And the same goes to everybody in the audience, whether you've attended for some solidarity, whether you're here to find out any particular insights, or whether you want to learn more. We really appreciate it. And this concludes today's lecture. Please, 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 this is the first time we've done a lecture in this way. We really appreciate your feedback. We're going to share now a QR code. You can just scan it and then do the quick, very, very, very quick survey. And that would really help us to tailor these lectures and take in your feedback going forward. Again, diolch yn fawr, thank you and shukran. I would like to wish you all a lovely weekend. Ramadan Kareem and Eid Mubarak for when the helicopter does go up and tell you when you can start celebrating your Eid. Have a lovely weekend, everyone. And again, thank you. Take care.